And this morning, yesterday was about in the 30s in Chicago. A little bit of rain, yeah. I think, yeah, 21.
Okay, just a few words before we hear from our guest speakers tonight. Pass your papers over, please. We have covered a lot of topics in this class. It's a little hard to move so quickly, but these are some of the things we've been talking about in the connection between religion and science. The neurosciences in the self, the first article that we read, religion and fundamental physics, especially quantum mechanics. You did some reading on how quantum mechanics is overturning common sense and suggests a special role for consciousness in the universe. We talked about natural laws, and you read some philosophical articles on how to understand natural laws, what they could be, and also Hume's critique of the idea of natural laws and the problem of induction. Then we talked about the cognitive neuroscience of perception. We had Professor Hoffman here with his interesting kind of thought-provoking views. Then we had Professor Devin talking about reductionism versus emergence. Remember his work on foams and the properties of the emergent properties of foams as opposed to liquids that they were made out of. So for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about evolutionary biology and religion. And that's a topic that's in the news a lot and has quite a long history. Just a couple highlights from that was Darwin, back his main work came out in 1859, and he realized that it was a controversial topic. The idea of evolution had been around for at least decades before him. There were people talking about the evolution of life forms on the planet, and of course his main contribution was to describe a certain mechanism for evolution and to gather a lot of evidence that supported that. So it was controversial, especially his next book, The Descent of Man, raised a lot of questions in the Christian context in which he wrote. And then the Scopes trial you've probably read about with William Jennings Bryan and the high school teacher who was accused of breaking the law for teaching Darwinism. That was in Tennessee in 1925. Then there's a dispute about creationism, which you may have read about, and most recently intelligent design theory. And when you read the book, you learned a little bit about that. So I'm just pointing out that there's quite a history to this. The most recent big event was the court case in the Dover, Pennsylvania school district case. This is one of the parents who challenged the school district's insistence that little seals be put on the inside of the book saying that evolution is just a theory. So there's a lot of interesting stories to be told about that and a lot to be learned about that as a chapter of our collective intellectual history in our country. But I would say, I want to suggest that there's been some progress. There's the case, the general case for the fact of evolution having occurred and evolution by natural selection being one of the primary mechanisms for evolution of life forms on our planet. That's such a well-confirmed idea. I hesitate to call it a theory, but it's extremely well confirmed from many, many different sciences. So the only, I think it's fair to say, only ignorance excuses a person for not realizing that fact. But there are still some disputes that we don't have the answer to yet as a human community, and there's a lot of work still to be done. But natural selection as a primary mechanism of evolution, that's pretty much uncontroversial. There's a lot of theoretical work on other kinds of genetic drift and other kinds of mechanisms that also produce evolution. But natural selection as a primary mechanism for that is very well established. And that the human species evolved by these same means. The genetic basis of inheritance we know now, and the shared molecular biological mechanisms of all life forms on Earth. You've probably all heard how much we have in common, how similar our genome is to that of chimps, for example. And a lot of the basic biochemical mechanisms that go on in our bodies go on in almost all living things. And I would say there's also general agreement by the main religious traditions that sacred scripture is not intended to be a source for scientific knowledge. this is not to diminish the importance of the Bible or the Quran or other sacred scriptures, but the intention of these documents is not primarily religious. There was a scene in Religulous where Reverend John Hott is interviewed. I'm pretty sure that's who it was. It passed pretty quickly. And he said, there's just no science in the Bible, absolutely none. It's not really what the Bible is about. And there's at least a growing consensus to that effect. Of course, there are very vocal minorities in our society that...
I have a question. Is he called Reverend John Hott? Because he's a professor of theology.
Yes, he's at Georgetown, but I thought...
But he's a layman. He's a layman.
Oh, he is? Oh, let me correct that. I'm sorry.
And he's normally known as Jack, but his name is John.
Yeah. I've never met him, and but I thought from the movie it looked like he had clerical garb on, but maybe not. I will change that. I won't take our time to change that.
He wouldn't.
Would he laugh at? You'll have to tell him he'll get a kick out of that. Okay, it's also clear that one sort of relaxed stance we can take to this question is to just recognize that science and religion are two different ways of knowing, and that they needn't be in conflict. And I think that Professor Ayala says that very clearly in his book, and that's, I think that's, many people have that sort of relaxed attitude toward the relationship between the two. There are obviously many kinds of questions that can't be answered using the methods of the natural sciences. We didn't have time to study scientific method in detail at the beginning, but basically in the natural sciences, the physical sciences, depend a lot on operational definitions and then development of quantitative mathematical theories. And we just don't have a way of defining something like love or meaningfulness or trust or lots of things that we all know are realities in human life, but since they're not amenable to operational definition, we can't sort of study them by measuring values of these variables and then relating them mathematically, and that's the basic method of the sciences. Dash is smiling. I predict a hand is going to go up soon, but
I'll save it.
You'll save it? Okay. So examples of really important areas that don't use the same methods as the natural sciences would be epistemology, studying what's the basic character of our knowledge, what's the relationship between the kind of knowledge we construct and objective reality. That was a big issue in Professor Hoffman's talk. Metaphysics, which is about the fundamental character of beings and being in the universe as we know it. And that is very closely related to the physical sciences, but somewhat different. Aesthetics and ethics, I think, sort of obviously deal with questions that aren't amenable to the method of the natural sciences. So I would say the state of the question has shifted historically somewhat. And to me, the most interesting questions are questions of these types. So I'm just throwing up here some things. I'll put these slides, if you want, up on the website too, along with the PowerPoints of our guest speakers. But let's just run through these quickly. And we're going to try and have a little bit of a group discussion or panel discussion with our two speakers, myself up in front, and you able to just ask any questions that you want to at the end of the hour. So these are some things I'd like us to talk about, but it's going to be your special time, and we can talk about whatever you would like at that point. Given that the human species has evolved as part of the general evolution of life on our planet, to what extent is human behavior biologically determined? This is really an exciting area of research because we're all familiar with, for example, drugs that you can take to alter your mood, or the fact that certain kinds of brain damage produce very specific deficits. So we're all familiar with the fact that there's a lot of correlation between events in the brain and our conscious experience, and that many of these aspects of functioning of the brain are fairly directly genetically controlled. So we are probably going to be in for a lot of learning about ways in which aspects of our conscious experience and our behavioral dispositions are genetically shaped, at least. And I think we should be open to a very deepened understanding of ourselves. We should be sort of relaxed and ready to learn ways in which behaviors like loving your baby have a very firm genetic basis. And we should view this in a positive way as a chance to learn more about ourselves. But what are the limits of that? How much will science be able to alter human beings? That's an interesting thing to think about. Will we be able to replace neural circuits with little chips in the brain? You may have seen on TV, there have been a couple, if you watch science-type programs, people who are completely paralyzed who can control the cursor on a computer by thinking, because they have something implanted in their brain which allows them to think something, to move the cursor of a computer just with their thought. There is a causal mechanism. It's not like a miracle, but it's going through the computer chip rather than through the normal means. And so there are all kinds of new possibilities that we'll be learning about ourselves, and we should be open to those sorts of things. What's the relationship between our conscious experience as we think of ourselves as persons with free will and responsibility, and an openness to transcendence, an openness to God, or to a kind of depth of ourself that goes beyond the physical universe? What's the relationship between that, what's traditionally been called the soul, or our Buddha nature, or something like that, and biology? Is that just an illusion, or is there top-down causality? Does a spiritual practice sometimes influence our biology? Is there top-down causal relationships? Is the scientific picture of the universe and our place in it our best knowledge of objective reality? Or, as Professor Hoffman suggested, is science just part of our user interface? Remember what he said about, for example, the theory of evolution. It's not that it's not well confirmed and not that it's not good science, but science itself is a construction based on our particular kind of user interface, and so it's limited by the limitations of our own conscious experience and way of consciously experiencing things. Will the natural sciences ever be able to explain consciousness, or is consciousness fundamental and partly creative of everything that we experience, including the natural sciences and scientific research? What relationship will or should develop between our use of technology to change our biology, our behavior, our minds, and our use of spiritual practices? Because we have exciting possibilities of altering human behavior, human experience, human mood, human predispositions, using science and technology. And we also know that at the basis of every religious tradition is a set of spiritual practices that enable us to move beyond our little egos, and to move into more positive emotions, and to develop it, to transform our minds, to use a Buddhist phrase. So we have like two projects that we can take into the human future. And what's the relationship between those two? What's the relationship between a person's spiritual practice and what they can learn and maybe make use of from science and technology? And it's not as though anybody has the answer to these questions right now. These are things that are sort of on our plate as a human race, and things that we'll be working on as we move into the future together. So that's all I wanted to say, and now I want to introduce our first speaker, Professor Francisco Ayala. Let me just get his PowerPoint up for us. Okay. So from reading his book and from the syllabus that I gave you that he's been a very busy person. He's written hundreds of articles. He's authored or co-authored something like 30 books. And in addition to being a first-rate evolutionary biologist and geneticist here at UCI, he's also been interested in the sciences and public policy and science education and questions of the role of science in society. So he's in the National Academy of Sciences, and one of his recent projects was the National Academy produced this book on evolution and the teaching of evolution and how evolution is related to religion. Because to help people who have sort of a knee-jerk reaction against the theory of evolution, to be a little more scientifically literate and a little more open-minded, and to realize that evolution is a wondrous thing. I mean, it's a beautiful thing, everything that we've learned about our own past and about the rest of life on our planet. And just to encourage the teaching of science, to raise the level of the teaching of science in our public schools and disarm some of the opposition to that teaching from religious quarters. What else did I want to say? I just noticed for the first time on this book that President Bush awarded him the National Medal of Science. I didn't know of that. But I know you've been very active in shaping science policy in the U.S. and science education, as well as being an excellent educator and researcher yourself. So he just returned from Chicago, and rather than going home and taking a hot bath or whatever someone would want to do in that situation, he's come here to talk to us tonight. So let's give him a big hand.
Thank you.
Does he need to turn the mic on?
Oh, we can.
He has it already. Well, thank you again. I came from Chicago, and it was not important to have a hot bath. It was much more important to have a glass of wine.
A glass of wine. Oh.
And dinner.
Did you have that?
Of course.
Oh, okay. Let me see. Let me just do the lights here. Let's turn off. I think that makes this.
I live a life where I do a lot of extramural lecturing, and the way I accomplished lecturing many places and still teaching here and doing my job so that I earn my salary is by combining things. So more often than not, when I take one of these trips, I'm lecturing in 3 universities which are nearby. And so this morning was at the University of Chicago, yesterday was at Northwestern University, and Monday was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. So you see, the advantage of being young, one can do a lot of work and keep going. Anyway, now we turn to serious matters. What I want to do today is to argue that although Darwin is given credit, deservedly, for the theory of evolution, that was not his most important contribution to science. His most important contribution to science was that he completed the Copernican revolution. That's the way I'm going to put it. That is, that he brought the world of life into the realm of science, explanation by natural laws that can be tested by observation and experiment. And he did that with the discovery of the theory of natural selection. So his most famous book, The Origin of a Species, which will be celebrating 150th anniversary next year, was published in 1859. He was born in 1809, so the next year will be the bicentenary of his birth. He was born actually the same day as President Lincoln, the 12th of February of 1809. In the book so-called The Origin of a Species, the title that Darwin wanted for it was an abstract of the theory of natural selection. He was planning to write a book in many volumes, which was going to call Natural Selection, and he wanted to call the Origin of a Species an abstract, but of course the publisher didn't want to call a book an abstract. But the point is that the book is about natural selection and only secondarily and incidentally about evolution. So that will be the main message of my lecture. And then in the later part, I'm going to talk a little bit about intelligent design, these criticisms that are being raised of the theory of evolution and the argument that maybe alternative theories to the theory of evolution should be taught in the schools. This is a painting very well known as Guernica. Has any of you ever seen it? Yeah, several of you, okay. It was painted by Spanish painter Pablo Picasso on April 26, 1937, early in the Spanish Civil War. Nazi airplanes, German airplanes, destroyed completely, bombed and destroyed from the air completely the city of Guernica. Was not a military target, was a small city of 7,000 people. They killed more than 1/3 of the whole population. But two things were being accomplished. One is the Nazis, the Germans, were starting to try the weapons that we were going to use in Second World War, which was forthcoming, and everybody anticipated it would be forthcoming. And the other thing is that the Basques, which are people, Spanish people living in northern Spain, were opposing very much the coup d'etat of General Franco against the established government. So it was a way of punishing the Basques. Picasso had been commissioned to paint a mural for the Spanish pavilion at the World Fair in Paris, to take place in Paris in October of the year 1937. Having heard about this bombing, he, in a fit of rage, he outlined the painting in 2 days and sketched it completely in 2 weeks. This is a big painting. It's about 24 feet long and a little over 8 feet high. Well, you would agree with me, and I think it would be hard to disagree, that this painting was designed to convey a message. It was designed by a person, a great artist, who had anticipated the message he wanted to convey, namely the horrors of war and the inhumanity of humans to humans. In the same way, a watch is designed to tell time, and a car is designed for transportation. These are the letters of the alphabet and the digits. They are butterfly wings. So we can use these letters to write text in English, or for that matter in any language, and use the digits to make calculations. But I think we would agree that although it can be used for a purpose, this alphabet was not designed to serve the purpose of the alphabet or the numbers to be used for calculations. In the same way, a mountain can be used for skiing, but it's not designed for skiing, and a river can be used for navigation, but most of us would agree that it was not designed for navigation. So what about the human eye? For that matter, many other organs of many animals and plants and other living organisms. Well, the human eye shares something in common with the painting or the watch or the car, namely that it serves a function, and it was designed to serve the function. There can be little doubt that the eye has all the parts that it has, organized in a very complex way: the cornea, the lens, the retina, the optical nerve, and many other parts which obviously would not have come to exist if they were not because they serve the purpose of seeing. On the other hand, the eye shares in common with the wings of the butterflies that is not the result of an anticipated design, the design of a designer who have anticipated what configuration the eye was going to have and designed for the purpose, but rather like the wings of the butterflies or the mountains or the rivers, they come, the eye comes as the result of natural processes. This is Nikolai Copernicus, who in the year 1543, the year when he died, published this book on the revolutions of the celestial bodies. This is 1543. The book was in Latin. All the science books at the time and for the following 2 centuries, including, for example, Newton's famous Principia Mathematica, they were all written in Latin. But in any case, in this book, Copernicus argued that the center of the universe then known was not the Earth, as it was thought at the time, but the Sun. So this is a drawing from a textbook at the time, and it has in the center the Earth with the Moon going around it, and then the planet Mercury, Venus, then the Sun going around the Earth, and then Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the constellations of the stars. That was the world as it was known at the time. Copernicus, in this drawing of his own hand, puts the Sun in the middle, in the center, then Mercury, Venus, the Earth, with the Moon, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the stars. And we know now that to be correct. And we know now not only that the Earth is not the center of the universe, but the Sun is not either. The Sun is just an average star out of the 100 billion or so that exist in our galaxy, and there are about 100 billion galaxies in the universe. There is a narrative in books that deal with the history of the ideas and the history of science that says that there were 2 great revolutions in the history of science. One was the Copernican revolution, and the other one was the Darwinian revolution. Both of them consisted in removing something was important to us from being the center to not being the center anymore. So the Copernican revolution consisted on removing the Earth from being the center of the universe to being just one more planet. And in the same way, the Darwinian revolution removed humans from being the center of the living world, because he presented humans as the result of an evolutionary process which includes thousands and thousands and thousands of species. So we would not be, as it was perceived traditionally, including by many religions, sort of the center of life and all the living world created for the purpose of humans, of serving humans, but humans were just one more species. And that he did in the Origin of a Species by means of natural selection, as I mentioned a moment ago, that was published in 1859. And in a representation of the kind that we evolutionists use nowadays, and actually the origin of this kind of representation is due to Darwin himself, where organisms are new species as branches of a tree, and when you find 2 branches which are near each other, they have a common ancestor. So the chimpanzees and humans are the most closely related, and then less closely related to gorillas, orangutans, and gibbons. And of course, we could go on with monkeys and other mammals and other vertebrates and other animals and plants, etc. So Darwin, according to this narrative of the history of ideas, removed humans from being just the center of all the living world. I will propose to you that that narrative is to a certain extent correct, because what it says is correct, but it misses what is the most important about the 2 revolutions. What is important about these two revolutions is that they start science in the modern sense of the word, explanation by natural laws, typically very simple laws that have universal application on Earth as well as in the heavens, and importantly, they can be tested by observation and experiment. So to understand the Copernican revolution, one has to understand it in the context of many of the people who followed him, notably Galileo and Newton. Notably but somewhat arbitrarily. I could have put others in addition or instead. But Galileo lived almost exactly 100 years after Copernicus. You can see died almost 100 years later. And Newton was born the year that Galileo died, lived basically a century later. And here they are, Galileo and Newton. And here some of the laws that they developed, that they invented, literally. For example, this one who says force equals mass times acceleration, and this is the inverse square law of attraction, which applied to the projectiles on Earth, but particularly was used to describe the motions of the planets by Newton. So that's what was important about the Copernican revolution, the beginning of science in the modern sense. But they had left out all living organisms, and they have left living organisms because of an argument that was very well developed by William Paley. It had been developed traditionally by other theologians and philosophers, but it was developed in great detail and convincingly, by using the evidence of the time, by William Paley in this book, Natural Theology, published in 1802. William Paley was an Anglican priest who was the author of several books of theology, and one very important one about moral theology, which together with natural theology were textbooks at the University of Cambridge when Darwin was a student there. They're part of the canon, so he read them, and like other students. He was also very well known as an abolitionist. He got a very successful career as a speaker for abolition, trying to eliminate slavery, which was still in existence in the United Kingdom at the time. In 1800, he became somewhat ill. He had to stop his speaking career and decided to study biology. And out of that study, in 1802, published this book, where he argues that where there is the sign, there is a designer, and uses many examples. One of them, the human eye, points out, as we were doing before, all the various parts, and says, if we look at the telescope, we see parts very similar to those of the eye put together, so to accomplish vision at a distance. And the same way, when we look at the eye, we see all these parts having put together to accomplish vision. And he describes many other organs, not only of humans, but of all sorts of animals and plants, and the relationships between animals and plants, plants, and the environment. It's a book of nearly 400 pages, which summarizes very well the biology of his time, and again draws the same conclusion, that all these contrivances, as he calls them, are clear evidence that have been designed by the designer, and because of the great universality of these designs and their complexity and the like, he says only God, the creator, omnipotent and benevolent, could have been that designer. So it was an extended argument to demonstrate the existence of God based on the design of organisms. That, of course, changed with Charles Darwin, because Darwin discovered very early in his life, when he was not yet 30 years old, after having finished a trip of 5 years around the world as a naturalist, which he undertook just after he had graduated from the University of Cambridge. So late in 1837 or early in 1838, from his notebooks, we know that he comes upon the idea of natural selection, and he realizes that this is an important discovery. And he says, now I have a theory to work with. And thereafter, all his life, he calls natural selection his theory. He never called evolution his theory. Evolution was accepted by many scientists at the time. So in The Origin of a Species, which, as I said, was intended by Darwin as an abstract, 460 pages or so, abstract, a multi-volume treatise on natural selection. The Origin of a Species, nevertheless, is mostly about natural selection. In the first chapter, he analyzes and tells the work of animal breeders and farmers, which use variations, hereditary variations, which are found in plants and animals, and they select them to produce plants and animals which have attributes that benefit us. Chicken that lay more eggs, cows that give more milk, and wheat that has larger grains and the like. So he says if variations occur in animals and plants, hereditary variations that are useful to us for our own purposes, it stands to reason that variations must exist, must come about in the world of life, hereditary variations which are useful to the organisms themselves, not just those that are useful to the farmers and to the breeders, but variations, hereditary variations which are useful to the organisms themselves. And he says if such occur, those variations which are beneficial, which help the organism, will improve the chances that the organism will survive and reproduce. And therefore these hereditary variations will multiply, and those that are injurious will be eliminated. So he develops this theory between chapter 2 and chapter 9 of the book. And then at the end of chapter 9, so to speak, says, well, if my theory of natural selection is correct, evolution must have occurred. But must have occurred in a certain way, which, by the way, was very different, although he does not put it that way. He says it from time to time, that the way evolution was understood by his contemporaries was not the way you would expect evolution to occur if it was directed or the result of natural selection. As an example of evolutionary theory of the time is the one of Lamarck, a French author, who in 1809, the year of the birth of Darwin, published a book called Zoological Philosophy. Philosophy at the time, by the way, didn't mean philosophy in the modern sense, but rather scientific knowledge. You know, the Newton and Galileo and others very often called their works philosophy, the scientific treatises. So he says evolution must have occurred in a certain way, and then he proceeds in the next 4 chapters to look for evidence of evolution and to show that it occurs as expected from natural selection. And then in the final chapter comes back to natural selection rather than just continuing with evidence for evolution. So the point I am making is that what Darwin was doing is explaining the diversity and the design or adaptations, as we would say nowadays, of organisms. And he was aware that with that he was completing the Copernican revolution. I mean, that is my expression, not his. that he was bringing now organisms to the realm of science, explanations by natural laws. So let me show you a summary of the theory of natural selection as it appears in chapter 3 of The Origin of Species. He summarizes the theory several times as he goes along. This is what I have already told you. He points out that there are more individuals than can possibly survive. This is sort of a precondition, as it were. He says, knowing that variations useful to man have undoubtedly occurred. These are the variations of the used by farmers and animal breeders. Could be thought improbable that other variations useful to each being in the great and complex battle of life should sometimes occur in the course of thousands of generations. If such do occur, can we doubt that individuals having any advantage, however slight, would have the best chance of surviving, of procreating their kind? On the other hand, we may feel sure that any variation in the least degree injurious would be rigidly destroyed. This preservation of favorable variations and the rejection of injurious variations I call natural selection. So this is what I was telling you. He assumes that hereditary variations occur, which are beneficial to the organisms, on the basis simply that hereditary variations occur which are beneficial to us in organisms. So some of them are beneficial to them. Beneficial variations will be multiplied through the generations and will be accumulated. Injurious ones will be eliminated. That's natural selection. In principle, a very basic, simple concept, but of course nowadays we have a whole body of science around natural selection, including great mathematical theories and complex and very elaborate. As I said earlier, after discussing natural selection and possible objections to his theory and various aspects of the theory, he says, well, if natural selection occurs, evolution must have occurred, and must have occurred in certain way. And very importantly, he says, evolution will not occur by organisms changing continuously, or so that every part of the organism changes in a particular direction. Going back to Lamarck, whom I mentioned earlier, Lamarck's theory of evolution was precisely that. He thought that organisms were progressing continuously, changing, so every aspect of an organism will be changing, a sort of reaching the next stage and the next stage and the next stage. Darwin says that's not the way natural selection works. At some point, some part of an organism will be changing, others not, and so it will be sort of a potpourri, as it were, of events with different things changing at different times, and sometimes organisms not changing at all, or parts not changing. And then he reviews the evidence available for evolution at the time, summarizes it in a very important way, and one of them comes from geology, or paleontology, as we would say today. Geology had come of age in the first half of the 19th century, and it had been discovered and demonstrated that when you have sediments exposed, as you have here in the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River, and this, by the way, is about 1 mile from top to bottom and covers about 1 billion years of sediments. It says when these sediments are exposed, in fact, those sediments have been formed at the bottom of the sea. That's what the geologists had demonstrated. This is not what Darwin had demonstrated. He takes advantage of that. And when fossils are found in these sediments, then we know that the fossils which are found down below are of organisms that lived before the ones that are found further on top, because the sediments will have accumulated over time in the bottom of the sea. and then, of course, moved up by motions in the planet. And in that way, he reviews evidence of change of various groups of animals, including the horse. This is not a drawing by Darwin. It's a recent drawing, but I want to show it to you for those of you who may not be completely familiar with the way evolution is represented in evolutionary history. We usually write the time on the left side. Here we go from 55 million years to the present. Then we use a kind of tree to represent the origin of a species. When a new species arises, then it's a new branch. And when a species becomes extinct, then the branch disappears. So you can see in the evolution of the horse that many species have come at various times, and most of them became extinct. From 55 million years ago, when this little horse ancestor was living, this was about the size of a medium-sized dog, to the present, many things have changed. I am noticing here, too, one is size, that from something like the size of a medium-sized dog, as I said, to modern horses. I am also indicating the reduction in the number of toes. But those things don't happen in parallel, nor do many other things. Now, contemporaries of Darwin said, if evolution by natural selection is occurring, where are the intermediates between large groups of organisms, say between reptiles and birds, or between fish and amphibians, or between the ancestors of humans, the apes, or ape-like ancestors, and humans. And just at the time that Darwin was writing The Origin of Species, no major transitional fossils were known. But just within 2 years, this animal was discovered, this fossil, which is known as Archaeopteryx. And it's fascinating because it has clearly the skeleton of a dinosaur, small dinosaur. This was an animal the size of a large crow or so. And yet, the head and the beak is clearly that of a bird. Some aspects of the paws are also more like a bird than like a dinosaur, and of course had feathers. So here you have precisely what Darwin was predicting, some features of an ancestor, the dinosaurs, some other features of the descendants, the birds. Incidentally, about 10 individuals of this species have been discovered, all in Central Europe, mostly in what is today Germany. The last one was bought was described only 5 years ago, and was bought by an American millionaire and who has a private museum of fossils in Wyoming. So now we can go and see Archaeopteryx. It's also the most complete and the best of them all. You can see them in our own country. Well, 2 years ago, this animal was discovered, Tiktaalik. Up to that point, in terms of the transition from fish, which live in water, to amphibians, which have 4 extremities, and they gradually evolved out of the water, and certainly their descendants completely so. What was known were these 2 fishes represented here. The most nearly like a amphibian was Panderictis, but it still was by all measurements of a fish. The more fish-like creatures known that could be amphibians was Acanthostega. Acanthostega lived 375 million years ago. Panderictis 385 million years ago. So a group of scientists said the transition must have occurred then about 380 million years ago in between. So they went to to northern Canada, where the Inuit live, because they knew there were sediments there which have been deposited 380 million years ago. And after several years of work, they discovered this animal, Tiktaalik, and several of them, about 20, which already has, as you can see, certainly in the forelegs, the complete girdle and the complete set of bone structures that made our limbs, not yet in the back. Again, some parts of the animal evolving before others, and the same with respect to humans. If chimpanzees and humans have evolved from common ancestors, where are the intermediates between those common ancestors and humans? None was known in Darwin's time. Darwin thought that they would be found. 7 years after his death, actually, the first one was found in Indonesia by a Dutch doctor, and something that he called Pithecanthropus erectus, and that now we call Homo erectus, and that lived between 1.8 and less than 1 million years ago. Here you have it. A number of fossils were found at the very beginning of the 20th century, not very many. Very notably, 30 years ago, an individual was found, Lucy, which we will see in a moment, which was a very young woman, where 40% of the whole skeleton of the single individual was found. But in the last 25 years or 30 years, precisely after the discovery of Lucy, the various governments and agencies and foundations have developed great interest in studying human evolution, the fossils that lead into modern humans. So the rate of discovery has increased tremendously, and now many fossils are discovered every year of what we call hominids. So the ancestors of humans, which are not ancestors of the chimpanzees, that is, those ancestors that lived after the lineage of humans separated from the lineage to the chimpanzees, are called hominids, and now thousands of them are known, including many species, more than are represented here. The oldest ones, about 7 million years. These bars represent the duration of a particular species. So this is Sahelanthropus chadensis. There you have another species there, Ardipithecus ramidus, etc. And then the name Homo is introduced for the first time for fossils that lived a little more than 2 million years ago. This bar, Homo habilis. Homo is our name. Homo in Latin means man. And they are called Homo because they exhibit from that point onwards a very important attribute, is that they are making tools. No tools are ever associated with any of the early ancestors. Homo habilis made simple stone tools, and something else starts to happen, and it is that the brain starts to increase in size and increases considerably from the size that all these other ancestors had, which was similar to that of a chimpanzee, about 2/3 of a pound, about 300 grams, all the way up to 1 kilogram 300 grams or 1 kilogram 400 grams, which are the sizes of modern humans. Oops. Can you help, Carol? Okay, thank you. So these ancestors, however, they were already bipedal. You think of the two major features that distinguish us from the apes. One is bipedal gait. The apes work in their force. They do what is called knuckle walking. They walk on their knuckles and that's why also they need very long arms, because they are not completely horizontal. We will see in a moment the representation of how they walk. Our ancestors evolved bipedal gait very early on, already almost from the beginning, 7 million years ago. We will see in Lucy clearly that she was bipedal, this Australopithecus afarensis. But the brain does not change. And the brain, which will be the second major feature that distinguishes us from the apes, because it's so much larger, it's 3 to 4 times larger, the brain starts to increase only with Homo habilis. So again, all these things happening according to what Darwin was predicting of different features evolving and at different times, and in all cases evolving as adaptations. This is the adaptations to the environment, that is by increasing the frequency of variations that are hereditary variations which are beneficial to the organisms. These are the bones of Lucy that were discovered, and I want you to look at the hip bone. Paleontologists can look at other bones and know that she was bipedal, but if we look at the hip bone, and here is reconstructed, and increase in size, Lucy was a little over 3 feet tall. Here I had increased that in size, so it can be compared, the shape with that of a modern human and with that of a gorilla. And you can see that with a hip like the one that we have, and of course the one that Lucy had, it's not possible to walk the way the apes walk, the knuckle walking. Well, other evidence, and I will go through this now very fast, that Darwin used after geology is what we call comparative anatomy. And here you have the forelimb of a human, which we use it for writing or for pointing, a dog, we use it for running, a bird for flying, and a whale for swimming. And yet they are all constructed of the same bones organized in the same way. Why? Because we all inherited this basic structure from Tiktaalik, that creature that was discovered recently. And evolution by natural selection happens by changing things a little bit at the time to adapt them to different functions as these animals perform. Another evidence that was used by Darwin and very extensively comes from comparative embryology, that is the development of animals, different kinds of animals, and I will not be reviewing that, and more importantly yet, biogeography, that is the geographic distribution of animals and plants, and that we will see later. But what I want to point out now is that molecular biology, a science that didn't exist in Darwin's time, has turned out to be the science that provides the strongest, most convincing evidence for the occurrence of evolution. Not that we needed more evidence, but it's additional overwhelming evidence. More importantly for us, for evolutionists working on evolutionary problems, molecular biology allows us to reconstruct evolution with as much detail as we may want, and with as much precision as we may want. That is the evolution of living organisms. So if now somebody is interested in knowing the evolution of a group of organisms, say apes or ants or whatever, if one invests enough time, enough resources, you can get to know with as much detail as you may want and as much precision as you may want the evolutionary history of those organisms. Molecular biology started in 1953 with the discovery of the structure of DNA, the double helix, but it's a discipline that has advanced dramatically. The molecular biology provides two sources of evidence. One of them, which clearly indicates that all living organisms come from a single form of life. That is, there was only one origin of all the life that now exists on the planet. If life may have started several times, but if so, all the other forms of life became extinct. All living organisms now come from one form of life. And we know that with evidence like the following. These are the 20 amino acids that make up proteins. Proteins are structural molecules for us, but most importantly, enzymes, which are proteins, are the ones that run all the process of life. They are the little engines, which are thousands of them in our cells, which are, making us alive, running all the process of life, all the transformations that take place all the time in cells, the energy and the like. This is a very temperamental computer. Maybe I have to move faster. Maybe it's what I don't know. Okay, anyway, that's okay. It allows us to take a little break by changing the rhythm. So all living organisms are all proteins in all living organisms are made of these 20 amino acids. There are hundreds of amino acids, many of them produced by plants, but the enzymes and the structural proteins of organisms are all made of these 20. The hereditary molecule is DNA in all organisms. In some viruses is a related molecule, RNA. The dictionary that transforms the information from the DNA to proteins is the same, again, in all organisms. I will not go into the detail, but the fact that this dictionary, which regulates, as I said, the transform of the nucleotides in DNA into the amino acids in proteins, is the same in all organisms, indicates that all have had a single origin. Well, it allows us also, molecular biology that is, to reconstruct evolutionary history, as I said, and the first demonstration of that took place, the first important demonstration, in 1967. All of this is relatively recent, and it was done with a very small molecule, a small protein called cytochrome C. In the 1960s, obtaining the sequence of a protein, that is finding out the amino acids, the letters, the protein letters that make a particular protein, was a very slow process and very difficult. And there was no way at the time of sequencing DNA, that is ascertaining the letters of the DNA. Now we can sequence DNA, and in fact it's much easier to obtain the sequence of letters in DNA molecules than in proteins. And indeed, as you know, human genome has been sequenced, now the several individuals, and the genome of many other creatures, including chimpanzees and many monkeys and many other animals and plants. But this is the work being done in the middle 60s, published in 1967. It was done by acids in humans, in the top line. So you go there to number 20 and continue there until the very end, number 112. In the second row, you have the sequence for monkeys, and you will notice that it's identical everywhere, the cytochrome C of monkeys, identical to humans, except in this particular place, where humans have isoleucine and monkeys have threonine. And horses, by the way, have also threonine, and many other animals, which is of interesting consequences, as I will say in a moment. And then when you compare those two with horses, there are 11 or 12 differences. So we construct a matrix which just simply says human to monkey 1 difference, human to horse 12, monkey to horse 11. And even if we don't know anything about the evolution of these organisms, which of course we knew it, we will infer from that information that is the evolutionary history of the three species. Humans have had a much more recent ancestor of humans and monkeys have had a much more recent ancestor than they have this is the ancestor they share with horses. So the ancestor of all three species is very remote. 11 changes have taken place. Ignore the numbers in parentheses. And notice that not only can we say the monkeys are closer to humans than they are to the horse, but we can also know that the change, the one difference between human and monkeys, happened actually in the human lineage. Because in that position where monkeys and humans were different, all the other animals are similar to monkey. So it must have been that they have changed in humans. So they took 20 species, constructed this matrix. Now, there is no way in which by hand one could reconstruct the evolutionary history of these organisms in using this matrix. It's because the possibilities are so incredibly many. But one thing was happening around the middle 60s, which is the availability of computers. That may surprise you, but the first computers were becoming available to scientists in the 1960s. So they use a computer, they put the information in the computer and two basic rules of evolution, and the computer gave them this evolutionary history for these organisms. Here you have 3 yeasts, which represent one of the branches. Then another branch goes to the animals, and that splits at some point. One goes to the insects, the other one to the vertebrates. Then we have fish and all other kinds of vertebrates, ultimately humans. Now, this tree is not correct in the details, but it was tremendously surprising at the time, in 1967, is that a small molecule could give you fairly accurate overall pattern of the evolution of so many organisms. This includes 2 billion years of evolution. The last common ancestor of yeasts and animals lived about 2 billion years ago. So that the single protein could do that. Now we have sequenced thousands of proteins and sequenced thousands of genes. And so whenever we want to ask a question about the relationship between some organisms, we go to the DNA and get the sequences and find out what happened. So once again, I will repeat, we can reconstruct the evolutionary history of living organisms with as much detail and as much precision as it may be wanted, just by investing the time and resources required. And indeed, we have reconstructed the universal tree of life. This is the universal ancestor of all living organisms, and you have a branch here going to the bacteria, another branch going to the archaea, and another one going to the eukaryotes, which are the animals that have cells like us, with organelles there and the DNA in the nucleus. So here we have animals, fungi, and plants. You see, these were the only organisms that humans knew existed 200 or 300 years ago, and they represent a small, tiny fraction of the whole history of evolution. Well, let us look at natural selection again. Remember, seeing that variations useful to man have undoubtedly occurred, can it be thought improbable that other variations useful in some way to each being in the great and complex battle of life should sometimes occur? And if such do occur, can we doubt that individuals having any advantage would have the best chance of surviving and of procreating their kind? On the other hand, we may feel sure that any variation injurious would be destroyed. This preservation of favorable variations and the rejection of injurious variations I call natural selection. Now, I'm going to show you how natural selection works with an experiment that we were doing in classes in Columbia University when I was a student in 1962 and 1963. I have come from Spain to study evolution there in Columbia University. What we now call molecular biology didn't exist with that name, but we have classes that were called bacteriology, where we did experiments with bacteria. This sounds very impressive, but it's very simple once I explain it. The experiment consisted in the following. We would take a test tube, one of these tubes that are used in labs, and you will have water, and in order to grow bacteria, typically all what you need to do is to add a source of energy, a sugar, usually sugar, ordinary sugar. And then you inject a few bacteria, they will multiply rapidly, and in a small tube with a 10 cubic centimeters, 10 milliliters, you will have something like 20 billion of these bacteria, Escherichia coli, which is a bacteria. They are bacteria which are very common in the human intestine and in the intestine of many other animals, which is why they were using these experiments, because some accident happens, it does not do a lot of harm to us. Now, this particular bacteria had two properties. One that share with most or all bacteria which have not been exposed to antibiotics, namely that they are not resistant to antibiotics, in particular to streptomycin, which is what we were using. Bacteria that have not been exposed to antibiotics are not resistant to antibiotics. But if they are exposed, they become resistant very quickly, as we will see. But this bacteria also had a mutation which made them incapable of synthesizing one of the 20 amino acids, histidine, which is what is meant by histidine minus. So you would introduce a few bacteria, a few hundred, and in 2 days you had 20 billion of them. At that point in the experiment, we added a drop of streptomycin, and all the bacteria died. Well, not all, because spontaneously there are mutations that occur with a probability of 1 in 100 million in bacteria, whether they are exposed to streptomycin or not, 1 in 100 million will become resistant to streptomycin. Because if there is no streptomycin, the bacteria will die out. But in the presence of streptomycin, they are the only ones that survive, which will be about 200. And 2 days later, you have 20 billion bacteria, all resistant to streptomycin. And at that point, we would move the bacteria to a culture that had no histidine, so they will die, except that mutations occur spontaneously from being not being able to synthesize histidine to being able, with a probability of 4 in 100 million. So about 800 survive, and in a couple of days you have 20 billion bacteria all resistant to streptomycin. The probability of these two events occurring independently is 1 divided by 4 followed by 16 zeros. So it's such a very small number that even if one would have a huge culture, we don't have a single bacteria with both mutations. But with natural selection, all the 20 billion bacteria have it. So this is how natural selection acts, accumulates rapidly those things which are beneficial to the organisms, multiplies them, taking advantage of the hereditary variations.
How fast do they, what's the generation time?
Depends on temperature.
That's amazing. I just want to make sure y'all
at most of the time when we do the experiments will be 20 minutes. We will be doing them about 37 degrees Celsius, and they will duplicate every 20 minutes. So it goes very fast.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, there you have natural selection.
Yeah.
Working very, very rapidly.
So let me show you now one example of nature, a simple example of natural selection. Do you see the two moths there? Do you? Well, those of you who have not seen a photograph, something like this, probably can see only one, that one, which is a black moth. This is a moth which is called Biston betularia. A common name is the peppered moth. And the typical moth, it looks like this, it's here. And mutations occurred, and just one major gene changes and makes them black. Well, what happens when that mutation happens? The predators, the main predators of these moths are birds. And the birds see things very much as we do. They will see very soon a dark moth much more easily than a peppered moth. So they will eat that first. So for many years, in the many collections that exist in Britain, as you know, the British people love to collect butterflies and moths and birds and all sorts of things. And there were no black moths until around 1850. some black moths start to appear in collections. And then more and more and more and more and more. They increase in frequency over the following decades. What had happened is the Industrial Revolution. The use of coal in industry and contamination, pollution, soot covering the trees, killing the lichens that grow on the bark of trees, and now this is the way the bark of a tree looks, and now you have there the black moth, and here you have the normal type. Now the ones the birds would see first were these ones, so that's why the other ones are increasing in frequency. So you see an adaptation. A mutation happens in some circumstances is not beneficial, but when the circumstances change, it becomes beneficial, and they start to increase in frequency. Then, in the middle 1960s, strict anti-pollution laws were passed in Great Britain, and coal was no longer used, and now the frequency of these peppered moths is increasing again. Well, the last example of nature is going to relate to the last two, because they are of the same kind, to biogeography. The distribution of animals and plants in various parts of the world is called biogeography. And this is evidence that Darwin used. And I'm going to start first with an example that Darwin didn't know, which is from Hawaii. The best places to study evolution are archipelagos which are very isolated from the other parts of the world, from continents, because they get colonized by very few kinds of organisms, and those organisms that colonize these archipelagos have no competitors because there are no other animals or plants of the same kind, so they start to evolve very fast and diversify. The most isolated archipelago in the world is the Hawaiian Islands, more than 2,000 miles from us here. So it has been colonized by very few organisms. Incidentally, the Hawaiian Islands are all formed right here at this place where the Kilauea volcano is now, which is active right now. So there is a hole, as it were, at the bottom of the ocean, through which there is volcanic activity coming from farther down the earth. So when there is volcanic activity, matter starts to accumulate, and if it goes for a long time, for some time, eventually reaches the surface of the ocean and starts to form an island. But these islands are in the Pacific plate, which covers a large part of the eastern and northeastern Pacific, which is a tectonic plate which is moving northwesterly at the rate of 2 inches per year. So as the islands are being formed here, they are being moved that way. So when there has not been volcanic activity for some time, when it starts again, then it may start to form a new island because the other island is gone. So we know now that Kauai was formed about 5 million years ago. The Big Island is the most recent. Kilauea is active right now. The Kohala Mountains, this volcano, the remains of this volcano, are a little less than 1 million years old, and Mauna Lea and Mauna Kea still less. And as I said, Kilauea is active now. Well, Hawaii has been colonized by very few kinds of organisms, but those that colonized Hawaii diversified tremendously. And a favorite example of mine, which is how I put it in this table, is Drosophila flies. These are the fruit flies that geneticists use to do experiments in the laboratory because they are easy to handle and very inexpensive, and they multiply very rapidly, not as rapidly as bacteria, not every 20 minutes, but every 2 weeks you have a new generation, and a female can produce 200 to 500 progeny. So there are 2,000 species in the world, and 500 of them come from Hawaii. The area of Hawaii is less than 4% the area of California, and yet has 25% of all the this species of flies, of Drosophila. Why? They were colonized, and now we know with genetic analysis that they were colonized from species from Oregon. At some point, probably carried by wind or something. These are very improbable events, but they happen on occasion. Some Drosophila came there, at least one female which was fertile, and was started to multiply. And because there were no other insects competing with them, other closely related insects, then started to diversify and produce many species, different species in different islands. Think for a moment, because it's the next point to which I will move, intelligent design, and the last point. Think for a moment the implications for people who say the species are created by God. You know, they're the designer who designs these organisms. So what happened in Hawaii? God started to say one species, another Drosophila species, another, and after 500 he says, oops, you know, that's far too many, you know, let us stop. And on the other hand, would imply this proposal, which, as I would say, therefore is in fact anti-religious, the idea of intelligent design. There are no native mosquitoes or cockroaches or many other kinds of insects. There are no mammals, land mammals in Hawaii. There were no native mammals they have introduced now by humans. So here you have the percentage of all this number of species given here for each kind that are endemic. Endemic means a species that exists there and only there. You see, for all these animals, the land mollusks, these are snails, insects, and Drosophila flies and birds, all the species have evolved right there in Hawaii. Darwin famously, in his trip around the world, stopped in the Galapagos Islands, which are not as isolated as the Hawaiian Islands. They are about 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador and Peru. They are actually on the equator, and there is the South American country called Ecuador, and they are just west of it. And they also have been colonized by very few groups of organisms, but notably they have these huge tortoises. Galapagos is the Spanish word for tortoises, and Darwin was fascinated by the fact, this is when he's a very young man in his middle 20s, that the Spanish sailors would be presented by one of these tortoises, and they would know from which island it came. So they have these tortoises do not exist anywhere in the world. There are large turtles, marine turtles, but these are land animals. They are huge. They weigh several hundred pounds. They are very sluggish. Darwin rode one of them and measured the speed 300 yards per hour, so not very fast. Well, this evolved in these different islands, different species, and could evolve there and only there because there were no predators. There would have been something like lions or tigers or even bear predators. They would not have a chance to survive and have evolved there. But many other kinds of organisms evolved there, notably the finches, Darwin's finches. There is only one species of these kinds of birds in the continental South America, and yet there are numerous species right there in the Galapagos, and we know the process by which they came about, which species came from which. So let me now finish by spending a few minutes talking about these proposals of intelligent design. And one of the proponents is Michael Behe. He's the only one among the proponents who is a bona fide biologist. He's not an evolutionist, he's a biochemist, but he published papers in scientific journals of biochemistry. And then he wrote this book arguing that organisms could not come by evolution, at least parts of organisms could not come evolution through natural selection, because, and he repeats the same arguments of William Paley that Darwin already had answered, because they consist of purposeful arrangement of many parts. Here is how he says how we know when there is the sign, when things are made of many parts, and if we take one of them, then the thing doesn't function. The same argument as William Paley, and he says he discovered the principle of irreducible complexity, which is when a system, it's just repeating what we said a moment ago, composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to cease functioning. So that's when we saw the sign, when there is a reducible complexity. Once again, the arguments of William Paley. So here you have the eye. You remove any of those, it doesn't function. The argument of Behe goes in the other way around, says it cannot come by natural selection, for the reasons precisely that I have been explaining, namely that natural selection works a little bit at a time and puts different parts together at different times. So natural selection could not put all the parts at the same time, so it cannot come, Behe would say, the eye by natural selection. Well, we don't need to study fossils to show how the eye, the compound eye, like the one we have, evolved, because mollusks include clams, oysters, squids, octopuses. They are a group of organisms much older than animals with backbone and vertebrates. So they are much more diversified, and they have a much greater variety of organs and the like. Here you have a limpet. These creatures are very common in the intertidal here. They are sort of conical shells that if you try to remove them, you can. Even with a pocket knife, it's almost impossible. They attach themselves to the rock. And why they attach themselves to the rock? Because when the tide comes, if they do not attach themselves to the rock, they are swept by the tide to the ocean, to the sea, and then they die. They don't have a way to live. They feed on the microscopic algae that are brought by the tide. So all what they need to know is whether there is light or not. If there is light, the tide is out, they start to move around and they are grazing. If the tide comes, it is dark, and therefore they attach themselves, which they do also when we try to grab them. But so all what they need is a few cells, pigmented cells in the skin, which allows them to know whether it's light or not, and with some nerve fibers. Now, here you have another mollusk. This is called in English a slit shell. It's elongated like this, and it's open on both sides. In Spanish, they are called navajas, and because they look like a pocket knife. And we in northern Spain is eaten considerably. It's a very delicious mollusk, but does not exist here. It's eaten also in China, in the whole coast of China, particularly to the south. So here you have a little more complex eye, and still one more complex. This is Nautilus. This is an animal that Darwin studied and pointed out that these animals, which are snails that live in the open ocean, they have not changed for millions of years. This is a case where evolution was not changing them because they do whatever they do very well. And by having this opening, they are able to detect motion, not only whether it's light or not. And then another marine snail, now it has a lens, the retina has been completed with nerve fibers forming a nerve. And then the octopus, which is just an eye as complex as ours, with as many parts, and with the nerve forming in the outside. because of evolutionary history, the fibers started to form always in the outside, so the optic nerve forms in the outside. For reasons of evolutionary history in the vertebrates, in us, the fibers, nerve fibers, started to form in this other direction. So the human optic nerve is formed inside, and then in order to go to the brain has to cross the retina, so we have a blind spot. So let me make the 2 points. First, it is obvious that even something as complex as the eye can come apart at a time by natural selection. Second, if God were the designer of the eye of the octopus and of the human eye, obviously God had greater love for squids and octopuses because they don't have a blind spot and we do. We have a defect that we don't. And that brings me to the major criticism that one can do of the theory of intelligent design, which is the existence of imperfections and dysfunctions and the like that we will see in a moment. But first, let me point out that the so-called theory of intelligent design is not scientific because it cannot be tested. When somebody tells Becky, well, what about the defects, like the defect of the human eye? And he says, how do we know what the intentions of the designer are? We don't know. Maybe the designer wanted to have for humans to have this defect. So if we don't know the intentions of the designer, it's clear that there is nothing that can be tested. But more importantly, there is no any evidence, any research, any hypothesis to test. Philip Johnson, another proponent of intelligent design, a professor of law at Berkeley, retired, said in 1998, give us 5 or 10 years and you will see scientific breakthroughs biologists had not dreamed of before I did. 10 years have passed. There is not one single breakthrough, one single discovery, one single scientific paper. The trial that was mentioned earlier in Dover that took place, the decision was made public was passed in December 20, 2005. This judge, which is a judge appointed by the current president, and who is, by the way, a practicing Christian, a very devout Christian, so has been said, I think, by good sources. He pointed out ID is not science, cannot be adjudged a valid, accepted scientific theory, for the reasons that we have just mentioned or have just seen, that it has not produced any peer-reviewed publications. It just cannot be tested. But there are other problems with ID, and is the defects of all organisms. Almost everything that you look at in humans or any other organism is defective. I mean, take the human jaw. It's an example. I point out there. It's not big enough for all the teeth. So they have to pull the wisdom teeth, at least to some of us. I have 3 of them pulled. I'm sure that many of you have had some of the wisdom teeth removed just simply because they don't fit. And then many of the other teeth are crooked, and orthodontists make a very good living straightening them. Any engineer, somebody in our engineering school who would have designed the human jaw will be fired the next day. I mean, a jaw is not big enough for the teeth. So, are we going to blame the creator for such a defective design? The human birth canal, as you know, is not big enough for the head of the baby, so millions of babies, innocent babies have died through history, and millions of women because of that. Not only imperfect, incompetent, and dysfunctional design, but there is a lot of cruelty in life, and even sadism. I mean, parasites can only live by destroying their hosts. This seems as a sadistic way of life. So that's why I say in my book that the theory of natural selection, evolution by natural selection, is a gift not only to science, because it completed the Copernican revolution, the scientific revolution, but also a gift to religion, because now we don't need to attribute the sadism or the cruelty of life or the defects of organisms to by implication an incompetent creator. The creator is not responsible of this design, so is the problem the theologians had for many years, what they call the theodicy problem, how to explain the existence of these defects and this sadism and cruelty if they have been the product of the design of God. Well, Darwin showed they are not the design of God. That does not mean that God does not exist. That's a different matter. Altogether, I think that maybe we may be discussing it more, but that's it. Thank you. Oh, I would. Sure, I'd be happy to have questions.
Yeah, would anyone like to ask Dr. Ayala a question?
Please don't speak all at the same time, because I can't hear you. Come on. Sorry, once one starts, other ones are brave to ask again. Don't you have some question?
No, not right now, though.
You were looking as if you were ready to ask a question.
So, I mean, your approach is very similar to, is it Gould's discussion of magisteria? Is that sort of the name that you would give to your point of view on?
Yeah, I have not entered in detail into the non-overlapping magisteria. That is his NOMA principle, non-overlapping magisteria. That is that religion and science do not have anything in common. They don't share common. I really have not discussed. All what I have done here is to say that the design of organisms can be explained without having to attribute it to God, and that can be explained by science, cannot be explained and should not be explained by religion. You have a question there? A little louder. There are some people back there making a lot of noise.
That just science and religion have different realities.
Well, okay. So this is related to the previous question. Yeah, I would say science deals with facts, religion deals with meaning, So science deals with the things that we can experience with our senses and that we can explain with scientific hypotheses and laws, and that we can test by observation and experiment. Religion deals with values, the meaning of life, the purpose of life, and matters which are not scientific and not subject to scientific investigation directly.
And they're supposed to be read as scriptures, right? Just nothing. They're supposed to be read as scriptures. Just nothing has to do with science because no.
You mean in the scriptures?
Yeah.
Well, many theologians would argue, most theologians, that the scriptures are not books of science. I mean, to take the Bible as an elementary book of astronomy or elementary book of biology, or for that matter, an elementary book of history, is not what the Bible was written about. That's what theologians, I think most theologians would say. The Bible is a book about religious truths, trying to convey religious truths. It matters about the relationship between humans and their creator, and humans with each other, and the meaning of life and the purpose of life. So that when people speak of the literal interpretation of the Bible, most theologians would say that refers to the religious truths. So another reason is because otherwise the Bible is self-destructive. Chapter 1 of Genesis, I don't know how familiar all of you are with the Bible, I suppose you are somewhat, narrates the creation in 6 days, where God creates several things, eventually the sun in the 4th day, then the animals in the water, other animals, plants, and on the 6th day he creates man and woman at the same time, both of them. That narrative ends on the 3rd verse of chapter 2. In the 4th verse of chapter 2 starts, this is how God created the world. And there is another narrative, which is quite different. The first thing that God does is to create man, male, one male. Then he starts to create other things, creates a garden, plants so the guy would entertain himself there, and then creates the animals because he's still not very interested in the garden, so creates the animals and tells them, go and name them, so to keep him busy. And then he still is bored, and then God goes, oops, I know what is the problem. He needs a woman. So he puts them to sleep, takes a rib out, and makes a woman out of it. So in chapter 1, both were created at the same time. In chapter 2, they were created first man and much later woman. Which one is true? Well, I would say, and most theologians would say, both are true, because both are teaching the same religious truths, that we are creatures of God, that we have a single origin, therefore that all of mankind is brethren. A very interesting concept at times when segregation, discrimination were common and some races were considered inferior, and that we are we are in charge of the world, and we should take care of the word of life, and many of the truths are implicit in that narrative. But you take it literally, not in terms of religious truths, but the facts as told, then the 2 chapters cannot be true. So that's why theologians don't want the literal interpretation except in the religious sense. But you wanted to follow up, I think.
Yeah, no, my other question is just that you explained that disease is just a consequence of evolution.
The diseases are a consequence of evolution, true.
And
So what about it?
no, I'm trying to remember what I was going to ask.
Well,
About
you see, evolution does not favor an organism for the benefit of other organisms. Favors organisms when they have mutations, the hereditary mutations, that they increase the probability of survival of reproduction. So the malaria parasites, kill 1.5 million children a year in Africa. In Africa alone, they make sick about 400 million people every year. They suffer from high fever. The malaria parasites are very efficient, and we know, in fact, work that I have done, and I have a paper in press about it, there's one mutation that made the malignant malaria a very effective parasite in attacking humans. One single mutation, and so effective that has spread, and all the particular species called Plasmodium falciparum, the agent of malignant malaria, now is very efficient at harming us. So evolution does not try to do things that are good for us, tries to do things for malaria parasites, things that are good for malaria parasites, for us, things that are good for us. Yes. Do you still want to follow up, or shall we ask it? Shall I ask somebody else? Yes.
Well, if the Bible is like ultimate truth, then why would it say that like man came first? If it's obvious through science that we know that man didn't come first, what would be the purpose of the Bible being narrative?
Well, again, these are questions that will be better answered by theologian, but I will try my best. The Bible is not trying to teach us biology. The Bible is not trying to teach us astronomy or cosmology. It's trying to teach us religious truths. Moreover, at the time when the Bible was written, these things about the origin of humans from non-humans were not known. So imagine, just for do the following thought experiment. Imagine for a moment that the Bible would say, and this is what happened, and will describe how various apes evolved gradually and eventually became hominids, and will describe the hominids. It doesn't make any sense. People could not read it, could not understand that. So they are using common knowledge of people who lived at the time when the Bible was written, but what is thought to be inspired and revealed by God for people of faith, what is revealed is the religious truths, not the other details. You wanted to follow up? No? Okay, you.
So I think what she's getting at is, how do we separate between religious truths? What do we take seriously? What do we take not seriously? Because it would lead us to believe that we take nothing seriously, and it's up to our own interpretation.
No, I don't see why one would have to go to that extent, but in any case, that is why they are theologians. They study the Bible and identify the aspects of the Bible that are fundamental truths and to be considered and taken into account. They are experts in on the scriptures. And, yeah.
I have a question now. We had Professor Hoffman talk about the mind-body problem, which is a problem listed as number 2, I think, in Natural Science magazine.
Yes.
Yeah. And is it Nature? Nature. Yeah. And many scientists think that we're not capable or selected for solving the mind-body problem. Just like we don't have the brain function to know what it is, just like a cockroach cannot fathom calculus. Do you think we are naturally selected to uncover or solve that problem?
Yeah. Well, the problem is identified as one of the 2 or 3 most important problems in human biology in my book, too. So you don't need to cite Nature. You could cite my book.
Got it.
Okay. I think that's one of the most important problems that science has to solve. My way of putting this is how the chemical and electrical signals which are used, we know, that's the way neurons communicate with each other, how those become transformed into thoughts, ideas, feelings, and eventually how out of the accumulation of sensations and develops the idea of the I, the concept that we all have, that we exist as an individual, which is continuous in space and time. How out of the multiplicity of experiences, which basically are, as I said, chemical and electrical signals, there emerges the individual, the sense of the person who lives and knows that will die. By the way, we are the only ones who know that we exist as individuals. No other animals do. And I'm sure you will be willing to challenge me about that, but maybe we'll leave it for some other time.
I'm going to have to step in here because we need to leave enough time for our second speaker, but why don't we, can we take a really short break, like a 3-minute break or something, just enough time to go to the restroom or answer a cell phone call or something like that?